on Awkward Conversations week 3, and I'm excited. I'm excited for that. I'm excited because today, this evening, the Chiefs are taking on the Steelers in the playoffs. I am really, really excited to watch that. I'm really, really excited to watch the Steelers make the mistake of trying to stop Dontari Poe on ice, 345 pounds going in the same direction. Gonna be beautiful. I love the Chiefs, and I'm really excited. Today is the first time that we get to play in this playoffs. If you haven't been following, we had a bye first week, and so this is our first game, and it's got me excited, but it's also got me a little bit nostalgic because I'm remembering my first playoffs game that I can remember, and that was actually back in 2003. That was the first game that I really remember being focused on the Chiefs for. It was a great year for the Chiefs. That was the year they went 13-3. That was Priest Holmes and Dick Vermeil and Will Shields and that really incredible offensive line. Great year for the Chiefs, a little rougher year for Bill. I was in high school and I was a wrestler, and at the start of wrestling season, coach told me I had to cut from 175 to 160, which is not my favorite thing to do. Some of you know I like to eat, so cutting weight wasn't my favorite. But it was a good year, and I actually got to go to a football game that year. And I remember the Friday before the game as my wrestling coach pulled me aside. And he knew how hard I'd worked to cut the weight, and he knew how hard it was to lose 15 pounds. He also was very keen on me making sure I made weight for the next tournament. And so coach pulls me aside and goes, listen, you're going to be at Arrowhead this weekend, and you're going to be surrounded by 10,000 smokers and grills, and it's going to smell delicious. And I know you haven't eaten a meal in a couple days, but I have one very simple but very powerful piece of advice. No matter what you do, don't eat anything. And that sounded like solid advice for a high school wrestler who was trying to cut weight. It sounded like good advice. Now it sounds like terrible advice, and I recommend the opposite of that. But back in the day, that was good, solid advice, and I wish so badly that I had taken it. I knew Coach had good advice, but I also knew just how good bites of barbecue chicken taste when you haven't had meals in several days. I knew how succulent and tender and bursting with flavor they were. I knew that I could smell that overpowering aroma as I just hung out with my friends at the tailgate. I also found out that aroma would continue to ooze out of my pores for about 3 days after the game was over, as I jumped rope in full sweats to try to lose the weight I had put back on, and as I found that my aroma was so powerful that the cheerleaders for some reason gave me a very wide berth as I was trying to cut back down in shape for the next tournament. I don't know what it was that made me so hesitant to listen to Coach. I knew he had good advice. Maybe it was because my stomach was rumbling loud. Maybe it was because the chicken looked so good. Maybe it was simply because I was a little bit defiant as a child, and my oppositional phase lasted a few years, maybe 15 years longer than it's supposed to. But for some reason, even though Coach had good advice, I wasn't in the mood to listen. There's something about certain situations and certain moods that leave us not in the mood to listen. They leave us unwilling to listen to the people around us. It doesn't matter if they're right or wrong. Something about where we're set up in certain situations means that they have no chance. Maybe it's simply that they've slighted us in the past. They said something or did something to hurt us once upon a time, and now we are going to refuse to give them the opportunity to prove they're right. Maybe it's because they come from the other side of a social or political divide, and we can't see past the fact that they have Republican or Democrat attached to their name. Maybe they're an anchor from that one news source that we refuse to call real news. And because it's on MSNBC or it's on Fox News, one side or the other is going to say it must be fake. There are times that we refuse to listen to the other side. There are situations that make it impossible to listen to people that don't say the things that we want to hear. This is true even for kind, loving, good people, even for Christians. Times where we become oppositional, where we become defiant. Even for people that we would normally get along with, it's the situation that makes things so tough. Maybe it happens to your kids occasionally, and they're normally angelic and always listen to everything you say, right? But for some reason, when they don't quite get a full night's sleep, everything becomes a struggle. Or maybe it's your neighbors, and you love talking to them, and you have a great relationship with them, but when just the right hot button issue is brought up, you start to question, why do I ever talk to these people? Division happens. It's become our new norm in how we talk to one another in America. Look at our political debates from 2016. They were so divisive that the president's farewell address on Tuesday night spent a large chunk of the time with the simple idea that maybe we should talk to other people. Maybe we should talk to other members of our own country with charity and grace and openness. He did a great job setting up this sermon. Thanks, Obama. Even Christians struggle with listening to others. In a recent poll, 70% of respondents described Christians as insensitive to others. When 87% of respondents chose a word to describe Christians, 87% described Christians as judgmental. That hurts. Last week, we looked at how to initiate awkward conversations. How do we go to another person and speak truth, but do so in a way that also brings grace and brings us closer together? This week, we're going to look at the other side of the conversation. How do we, as Christians, as people of faith, respond with grace when someone brings a hard truth? How do we respond when someone else starts that awkward conversation and says that thing that we don't want to hear? More importantly, how do we cultivate a disposition that can respond in a Christian manner when we are the ones undergoing that confrontation? Division happens, but it's our disposition that determines our reaction. How do we cultivate that Christian disposition that allows us to respond to an awkward conversation? There's a story in the Bible that's full of awkward conversations and gives us a few cues as to this. This is the story that RJ read. We read 3 different parts of it, 3 different pieces. It jumps around a little bit. I want to focus on these 3 questions, these 3 conversations that a man encounters. I'd encourage you to go home and read the rest of the story. It's a great story. It's John 9, and it's the story of a man being healed of blindness. But it starts simple enough. Jesus and his disciples are walking along. As they come into a town, they see a man. He's been blind since birth. He's sitting there probably begging because this would be the only job opportunity open to a blind man in the first century. It was a tough life, probably one of the toughest lives you could have back then. And so as he sits, maybe by the entrance to a city where many people would come by, maybe by a temple where people might remember to be more charitable, he's asking for a few meager coins to buy his food. And Jesus and his disciples walk by, and they would have seen this guy as everybody left a wide berth, as people walked to the other side of the street to leave a little extra space. Now, it wasn't just because they were uncomfortable about helping or not helping. Actually, people in the ancient world had a little different perspective on physical disabilities than we do now. In the ancient world, it was a commonly held belief that if you had a physical disability, it was the result of some sin that you had committed. A little bit like the Hindu belief on karma that we now see in different parts of the world. The ancient world believed that if you had a problem, it was your fault. And so as people see this man who's been blind since birth, they begin to wonder, what could he possibly have done that he was born blind from the moment of his first breath? That helps us understand the disciples' question as they come to Jesus and ask, Father, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? It's a question of fault, a question of blame. Who caused this? Who caused this problem? Who caused this shortcoming? Who caused this pain for this man? And who can we hold responsible for it? It's a question that sometimes we ask. Actually, that a lot of times we ask, or at least I do. When our favorite sports team loses, we want to know, who can we blame for this? We blame the refs, and if that doesn't work, we blame the play calling of the coaches, maybe even turn on one of our own players who missed a play, never ever considering that maybe the other team was just better. When things go wrong in our families, we ask the question, who did this? Who broke this? Who left this on? Who caused this? And who can we hold responsible for it? It's a question of blame. But when Jesus sees this blind man begging on the side of the road, it's not a question that he asks. Jesus does something a bit different instead. Jesus doesn't ask who caused this. Instead, Jesus goes up to the man, and in one of the more awkward moments of Jesus' whole ministry, Jesus goes up to the man and he does something we wouldn't expect. Jesus stands in front of this man begging by the side of the road, and Jesus spits in the dirt. And then he takes that spit and mixes it with the mud and makes a salve, and he begins to wipe it on the man's eyes. It's a really uncomfortable scene. The more we imagine it, the more we begin to wonder how everybody watching it would have looked. This is awkward. This is weird. This is strange. Unless you're a man who's been blind from birth and now for the first time in his life sees, and then it's awesome. And the man begins to see and begins for the first time to experience something that so many of us take for granted. Jesus doesn't seem to care about why he's blind since birth. Not because Jesus is insensitive, but because Jesus never asks, who can I blame? And instead always starts with, how can I serve? That's his MO. When 5,000 of Jesus' disciples and followers are following him into the wilderness and run out of food and they're hungry and starving, Jesus never looks at them and berates them and says, why didn't you plan ahead? Why didn't you pack a lunch? Why didn't you think this through? Instead, Jesus looks out and feeds 5,000 people. And we have one of the greatest miracle stories that we still talk about today. When Peter follows Jesus out onto the water and begins to sink, before he ever asks Peter, why do you have so little faith? Instead, he first pulls him up out of the water and saves him. If Jesus stopped to ask if everyone was blameless before he healed them or fed them or died to forgive them, I'm not sure many of us would make the cut. When we go looking to assign guilt, it's pretty easy to find someone guilty. But that's not Jesus' first question. His gut level reaction, his disposition to seeing a guy in need is not to ask, who can I blame, but rather to ask, what can I do to get him out of this? Now, don't get me wrong, Jesus takes sin seriously. Jesus does call people out and call people to a higher life, a more noble and pure life. Last week we talked about how Jesus teaches us to do the same, but unlike the disciples, that's not his first question. Maybe we can learn from this. Maybe that can become part of our disposition, to see someone in distress or even someone with whom we disagree. Someone who might need a little bit of truth. And to stop asking, who can I blame? And instead ask, how may I serve? Now, the disciples aren't the only one with an awkward conversation for this guy. After this man is healed, he runs into some of his own neighbors, people who have known him probably for his whole life, people who have seen him begging day after day after day. They've known him perhaps since he was a boy. And somehow at this moment, they don't recognize him. This is John 9, 8-9. The man's neighbors and those who used to see him when he was a beggar said, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said it is, and others said, "No, it's just someone who looks like him." Now, to be fair, it is rare to see a person born blind restored to their sight. But it's also a bit sad that for these people who knew this man so well, the most defining characteristic they can give to him isn't his looks or his personality. It's not his character or his integrity. It's blindness. All they can see in him, all they can label in him, is the hurts in his own personal history. They know him as the blind man, and when he loses that one attribute, they no longer recognize him. Which makes you ask, who's the blind one really in this story? See, it's unfortunately common in our world to label people by their own limitations and shortcomings and hurts and disabilities. Sometimes we do it to ourselves in our own personal shortcomings. I always struggle with this, and we assume that we always will. In cases that's true, but in cases it's not. Maybe it's with a coworker and we recognize the coworker as the one who's always late to the office or the one who always asks the question right as the meeting is getting over, and we could all go if you just kept your hand in your lap. Anybody have that coworker? It happens. Maybe it's the family member who we recognize as the one who has their children least in control, or the friend with chronic mental illness, and that's all we can see in them. Every time there's that same underlying awkward conversation. How can someone like you change? Labels don't leave a lot of space for change. When I was in middle school and high school, I was a competitive swimmer. And I remember one day I was at the pool and I was swimming laps, and as I was swimming, I was pretty alone there, and then I watched as a mother came in holding her young daughter. And the daughter had some fairly severe physical disabilities, very severe physical disabilities. And it looked like the mother was going to teach her daughter to swim. The daughter had on a life jacket, and as the mother and the daughter got into the water, it became clear that the daughter could not swim on her own, that she needed both the life jacket and also the help and love of her mother just to keep her head above water. And as that's going on in the shallow end, and I'm still plowing through lap after lap after lap, I see them every time I take a breath. And as this goes on, I began to feel a bit of shame of my own ability. And as I began to see them, I began to feel a bit of pity for this young girl. Until I hit a pause between my sets, and I looked. And I saw as this mother and her young child turned. And I see on the face of this young girl, not a face of pain, not a face to be pitied, but instead a face radiating joy. Joy in the splashing in the water for the first time. Joy in the love of a mother who's willing to support and care for her. Joy in a new experience. I had been so consumed by what I had seen in her, which was only her shortcomings. But I'm ashamed that I missed the beauty of her joy. Sometimes when we see people around us, it's tempting only to see their disabilities and difficulties. But that's not how Jesus sees people. In the Bible, Jesus never defines people by their problems, physical disabilities, mental disabilities, spiritual disabilities. Instead, Jesus sees all people, every single one, as fully human. Actually, Jesus sees all of us as fully human. I think sometimes it's hope that we might change that keeps us from giving up. It's hope that allows us to transcend those challenges that may be overcome and to endure the ones that may not. We know people who have given up hope. We have friends who have problems and they can't quite control their anger, and so as long as we label them as the one who will never be responsible for their own emotions, they're going to stay that way. But when we begin to hope and expect, and they begin to hope and expect that there is more to them than this, that they have struggles but also hope, change becomes possible. Change becomes desired. Sometimes it's belief that we can change that gives us a chance that we might change. In my life, I hope that I am never identified merely by my biggest struggles. But I also hope that I might see others the same way. Not as defined by their greatest defeats, but instead as beautiful creatures, living fully, and by God loved fully. I hope that we might begin to see people around us the way that Jesus sees us. The neighbors see this man as a label, as a disability. May we see instead the way Jesus sees, with hope and possibility. And that brings us to the last conversation that this man encounters. It's not long after Jesus heals him that he runs into the religious authorities. They catch wind of his healing. They want to know how the blind man stops being blind, because that's not the sort of thing that happens every day. But as we read more and more, it seems like this is less a cause of celebration and more an annoyance and a disruption. See, we only read one of the questions. RJ only read one of the questions they ask, and we actually read as they're asking the parents of this blind man how this happened. And we can tell from the parents there's a little bit of discomfort. The parents are kind of saying, whoa, hold off, don't ask me this. My son is old enough, my fragile son, go ask him these questions. Because the part we left out is where it says the authorities had already decided to kick people out of church if they begin to follow Jesus. These parents are so afraid of what might happen that they throw their own son under the bus. These authorities ask question after question after question, but it seems like they're searching for a very specific, very particular answer that they have already decided upon. See, they're the authorities and they know how things are supposed to work. God told them how things are supposed to work, and they know that different days are for different purposes, and the Sabbath, the day on which this story takes place, was a day for resting, not healing. God said the Sabbath was for rest, and so no one is allowed to heal on the Sabbath, not even the Son of God. They asked this no longer blind man how he was healed. He should have known better. There are rules, and the man doesn't seem to know how to defend himself. He's a simple guy, and he's had a miraculous day. And so when they ask him question after question, they ask him, is Jesus a sinner? They call Jesus a sinner. I love the man's answer. He said, I don't know whether he's a sinner, but here's what I do know. I was blind. Now I see. The authorities and the Pharisees call him again and again, question after question, barely listening to the words because they are convinced that he is wrong. But spiritual self-satisfaction has blinded them to the thought that maybe they might be wrong. Even when the evidence of God is, for the first time in his life, able to stare them in the face. Can you feel their smugness? It's that same smugness that allows people of faith to sometimes leave behind our faith, to be so busy claiming the name of God that we overlook the work of God. It's the smugness that causes 87% of millennials to describe Christians as judgmental, even though we follow Christ who said, judge not. It's the smugness that allows believers of all faiths to hate people made in God's image, even though we do it in God's name. It's that smugness that allows people to make war in the name of God and kill those that God made in the image of God. That smugness is dangerous for us. It's spiritual blindness. It starts small sometimes. And we become convinced that God is on our side, so we stop reading scriptures to see which side God might actually be on. Or since we're trying to be good people, anybody we disagree with can be labeled as bad people. The Pharisees can't see what's right in front of them because they're blinded by their own smugness. But the blind man offers a different way. He's open with what he doesn't know. He says, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. I don't know. Here's what I do know. I was blind and now I see. It's a refreshing humility. It's an openness to say, I have a limitation. I am human. Spiritual blindness, smugness, can destroy us. When we live fully in an echo chamber of our own thoughts, we're unwilling to listen to people around us, or most of all and most importantly to the God above us. We can become like the Pharisees. It's tempting to say that they were different and we are better, but I think that that's how they became who they were 2,000 years ago. The third part of having a disposition that can stay Christian in the face of confrontation is to have humility, that we might be wrong, to seek out God in the midst of it so that we might know the one who is right and follow him, and that he might open our eyes in our lives. There's conviction in this story. This is a story that I think is hard sometimes for people of faith to hear, because it's not always the people of faith that are the hero here. When I read it, I see so much of myself in the disciples, and my first question is often, who can I blame rather than how can I serve? I see myself in the neighbors, and I label people by their shortcomings and their disabilities. Sometimes I even find myself in the Pharisees, and I lean towards spiritual blindness and smugness. But when I read this passage, I also find hope. Hope on the micro level, hope for us, a disposition that makes it possible to respond like Christians in the face of confrontation. I find an example from Jesus, who lives differently against what we would call our own instincts. Rather, instead of like the Pharisees and the neighbors and the disciples, we find a disposition that can rise up within us as well. So I want to close with a question that's also a challenge. Which example will we follow this week and this year? We don't need imagination to see a world wrecked by division. We don't need imagination to see what it looks like when people refuse to listen to the other side and label them merely as them and wrong. But can we believe, and can we live to become a world where we choose to ask, how may I serve rather than how and who may I blame? Where we see past labels and see full humanity, and where we offer people the benefit of our humility rather than the blindness of our smugness. This is the challenge and this is the hope that we see in Scripture today. And so as we close in prayer, my prayer is that we might be people who earn and live after the name and example of Jesus and spread that light and that hope and that disposition into the world for all to see. Let's pray.